Welcome back. Now we've talked through what to take into consideration when building your workflow. Let's now look at some best practices for those who are already managing their workflows in monday.com, but where the workflows are growing and are now becoming large. There are three main ways to deal with existing workflows in the platform which were not originally built with scale in mind. These are cleanup and archiving, segmenting the board, and improving the user experience. So let's start with cleanup and archiving. Since we know that a board which has a lot of items can impact on its performance, we recommend reviewing a board which is starting to run into the problems of slow board performance or bad user experience to consider whether all of the items in the board are still needed, or whether some can be removed from the board. There are a few options for removing items from a board to improve performance. These are archiving items after a certain period of time using the archive function, and moving items which are no longer needed to another board. The main reason why we would choose to move items to another board rather than archive is if we still want to use these items in our reporting, as we can't report on archived items. Whether you decide to remove your inactive items through archiving or moving to another board, both can be automated. Let's take a look at how we can do this in monday.com. As you can see, we have a recruitment pipeline board here. We have our potential hires as items, and they are grouped by department. We also have an application date, a recruiter, our status label, and also the hire date. We may find over time that this board becomes very heavy, and so what we can do is create an automation that as soon as an applicant is hired, they will automatically move to our hired board. If we head over to our automation center, we can set up that exact automation. And we can say that when the hire date arrives and they are hired, then we want to move the item to our hired board. If you are dealing with a very large use case, then we do recommend adding new completed boards every quarter or year so that they do not become too heavy themselves. So for example, in this case, we may choose to create a hired board for each quarter. Next is segmenting the board. Another way to deal with a workflow which is already being used but which has become heavy is to segment the board. Segmenting one board into multiple boards can improve overall user experience, require less board automations, and increase the board performance. Let's take a look at an example. Here we have a simple project management use case, and instead of managing all of our items in one board so that it does not become too heavy, since we may end up having a large amount of projects with many different sub-items and subtasks, we can resegment the board to have different boards. So for example, we might choose to split the board per stage. So we could have one board for each of these three stages. So here is an example of one of those segmented boards, where we have created a board just for the design stage. As you can see, the design stage is then broken down into each of the different phases. We can then go ahead and create a high-level board for each of our three different boards to feed into, where they can each connect and mirror in all the necessary information. So the last way is improving the user experience. As we mentioned earlier, one of the main pitfalls we want to avoid is creating a bad user experience when scaling. Here are a few additional ways. Starting again. The last way is improving the user experience. As we mentioned earlier, one of the main pitfalls we want to avoid is creating a bad user experience when scaling. Here are a few additional ways that you can improve your user's experience and declutter your workflows when managing large use cases. Hiding and collapsing columns. If you have many columns which don't need to be seen regularly, such as ones that are connected to other boards through connect columns, you can collapse or hide these. Creating views. A board with, let's say, 20 plus columns can really feel like a lot to scroll through. So utilizing the views to segment different teams, or using the Me Dynamic filter, which we showed earlier in the webinar, to allow a slice and dice of relevant information. Just a note, creating views and hiding or collapsing columns won't improve the board performance, but will improve the user experience on the board. And lastly, you can create an account navigation or boards directory. When there are a huge number of boards on an account, many of our clients have found it useful to create a dashboard to help their users best navigate around and to add other useful links. Let's have a look at an example of one within monday.com. Here is an example of a template you can use. This can include a directory of where things sit, or perhaps request forms for making changes to the boards as we discussed earlier. It can also host company announcements, different kinds of countdowns, and team and board updates. So thank you for joining us in this webinar. We have now covered all of monday.com's best practices and recommendations for building and maintaining workflows at scale. Join us in Chapter 7, where we will summarize our main takeaways.